Hi, today our group will be teaching you how to write a good paper 1. The paper 1 will be teaching you how to write is based on these two texts. This graphic text and this article from the New Yorker. First, based on this paper 1 organizer, we would need an introductory sentence and a thesis statement. Our group came up with 3 thesis statements that can be used. The first one: the interpretation of influence from video games comes back to the ignorance of the spectator and whether or not they can relate its characters to real life situations. The second one: obscured violence in video games requires both players and audience to analyze the depth of nature of the game and the acceptance of the content. The third one: both texts address the issue of real-world violence being affected by the media, where the acts of violence is seen to be made okay in video games, inciting the thought that the crime they are performing is not that bad. Now the second step is we organize our thoughts into a table that has speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, subject, literary devices, tone. This is short for soapstone. They call it soapstone. And first I will give an example of how we can organize our thoughts into this table. First one, speaker. Text A, since it's a graphic text, you can see here, we said there are 2 voices that can be seen, but only one is speaking. The father said if this country would just get rid of guns, shows his awareness towards this topic. It allows the reader to understand what issue is being addressed in this graphic text. Now, here, there's Grand Theft Auto, GTA. But the speaker here does not discuss the pros and cons of GTA. Rather, it just magnifies the ironic approach that exists in many families. However, in text B, it focuses more in detail of GTA. It talks about the pros and the cons. We said that the speaker discusses about the pros and cons of games and GTA in particular. The speaker seems to be quite one-sided and promotes this idea that most games do not have a limit, and the players are free to do whatever he or she wants the characters to do, for example, rape. Second one, occasion. We talked about the time and the place of the piece, probably like the setting. For the first one, we know that in September 2013, there is a Minnesota school shooting, so we would assume that this is made this year, and it's quite recent. And for the second one, it's also written in September 2013. So occasion-wise and time-wise, they both came out at the same time, at a similar time, and we can conclude that that's why both of them address GTA and violence. Third one, audience. For the audience of this one, since it's a graphic text, this can be understood by both teenagers, children, and adults. It's more accessible to understand because there's not a lot of words, but it's not really explicit or implicit, but you can tell that it's quite ironic because the father is talking about guns, but right in front of him, behind his newspaper, his own children are playing with guns in a video game. For the audience of the second text, the New Yorker Post, the writer wants to, the speaker seemed to be talking to a wide audience, maybe a group of adults. It is also quite likely that he wanted game creators to read the article and become more aware of this issue.
So for the audience of the text A, it is seeing that it's a context of a newspaper cartoon. The target audience is the people who read the cartoon in the newspapers, and like the people who are unaware of these issues, such as the parents, that like how it's obscured that their children themselves are actually playing violent video games where they are actually going against it themselves. And for text B, the speaker seems to be talking to a wide audience, maybe a group of adults. It is also quite likely that he is the wanted one. So for the audience of text A, seeing that it's in the context of a newspaper cartoon, the audience would be the people who read the newspapers, or the people who are unaware of how video games are violent, such as the parents, as shown in the text itself. The parents who are unaware of these violence performed that by their child. And for text B, the speaker seems to be talking to a wide audience, maybe a group of adults. It is also quite likely he wanted game creators to read the article and become aware of this issue so that they would try to stop the violence from influencing too many people. And for the purpose of text A, instead of people complaining against or for the gun law, they should look and evaluate what's happening in their own household because of the irony and ignorance shown in the text A. And for text B, the purpose is that the writer wants to spread awareness to let people know that violence is promoted since a very young age and is also used in the media, gaming, as one aspect that people rarely expect of violence, but he brought the idea up that it made us question whether violence in games can affect our attitude towards violence. For subject, in text A, the main issue is addressed is violence, but text A especially focuses on guns, which is shown as Minnesota shooting, right? And how the father says that he wants the country to get rid of guns, while his children are actually playing video games about shooting people. And for text B, as subject, the author chooses a few topics to talk about, generally about violence and sexual violence, and it also talks about how video games actually have a lot of potential to show the players about lives of certain people in certain situations. However, they choose to use that potential only for violence.
So the next section is literary devices, tone, and conclusion. For the literary devices, for text A, there is a sense of irony and juxtaposition shown by the black and white color. Now, this is an example of what literary devices you should write for each section. The way to organize it is to have around 1 or 2 paragraphs per section and not to write it separately as in text A and text B, but you have to incorporate it together. So for instance, the first paragraph could be, for instance, both texts have a similarity of both having irony. So therefore, you can write an introductory sentence that would introduce the whole paragraph that basically just talks about the different irony, the different ways irony is presented in both texts. And then an example is, for instance, in text A, it is an image, and it is taken from an eye level, which also adds to the fact that the author is trying to make it this way so people can relate to it because they're seeing it in eye level. Always remember to refer and ask yourself why the author is doing it, because the author will always do it for a reason, so always write that in your essay. And try to use these words such as embedded, anchored, summarized, amplified, magnified, expanded, aggrandized, applauded, belittled, advertised, exaggerated, bolstered, reinforced, fortified, consolidated, or evoked, because these words can help improve your scoring criterion D, which is language. The next section you should do is tone. Tone is the attitude of the author, and the author will always present his or her point of view or point in a specific tone. Again, like other paragraphs, you have to write it comparing the two texts instead of writing it separately. For instance, here with text A, we can say that it is a bit in a satirical or ironic tone because, as you can see, the dad is saying one thing, if this country would just get rid of guns, and the children are playing Grand Theft Auto, and they're also shown in the picture killing someone. In addition, you can also talk about whether or not it is informal or formal. This can be a difference because, for instance, in text A, it is informal and a bit comical because of the mocking tone, and it is presented in a conversational language because of the context it is put in, which is a newspaper. Whereas text B, the article, it is more formal and presents the argument in a very organized manner. However, it is still in a diction that is easily understood. And lastly is the conclusion. With the conclusion, just like any other good conclusions, you cannot make any new points. Rather, you have to restate points that you've already made. For instance, seeing that the context of both cartoon and article are created in a similar time frame of the same year, the intended purpose and the audience of the two texts are very similar. It's also important to address the authors by their names if you can. So for instance here, the name is Mike Lester and here is Simon Parkin, because it means that you're not generalizing the text A and text B, and it just looks better for the examiner when marking your essay. For instance, however, a major difference between the two is that Simon Parkin, author of the article, attempts to present his argument from a more objective viewpoint, whereas Mike Lester, illustrator of the cartoon, argues the way that the issue is handled instead of the matter itself. Lastly, you need to always end in one sentence that will summarize your whole essay. For instance here, despite having a great difference in tone, the anchor of the two texts are very similar in the sense that it implies that the interpretation of the video game requires the critical thinking of the spectator, his or herself, because just like everything else, there will always be pros and cons. This line here is also restated again in the thesis, so the end of the conclusion should always restate the thesis.